Donald Trump is actively threatening to detonate a $6 trillion North American trade agreement. And the trigger he is pulling is aimed squarely at the Canadian dairy industry. We are standing on the edge of the most consequential economic cliff of our generation. And Washington is demanding the complete dismantling of Canada's agricultural protections before renegotiations of the USMCA trade pact can even begin. The risk here is not just about a few trade tariffs. It is about the entire cross-border economic flow that keeps both of our nations breathing. But here is the catch that changes absolutely everything. The grievance lighting this fuse, the very foundation of this entire geopolitical standoff, is based on a number that is being weaponized to deceive the public on both sides of the border. So, what happens when two massive economic giants go to war over a problem that does not actually exist in the way politicians claim it does? For years, the rhetoric pouring out of Washington has been deafening. The Trump administration, figures like United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and sympathetic media networks have been screaming about Canadian dairy tariffs. They throw around numbers that sound absolutely staggering to the average ear. They claim we impose tariffs of 243% on milk. They say we slap tariffs of 245% on cheese. And they constantly repeat the terrifying claim that Canada hits American butter with a 298% tariff. When you hear those figures, it sounds like highway robbery. It sounds like Canada has built an insurmountable, hostile fortress to cheat American farmers out of their livelihoods. And it is a highly effective political weapon because it generates pure, unadulterated outrage among American voters who feel they are being ripped off by their northern neighbor. But let us strip away the political theater for a moment and look at the actual math. What exactly is going on at our shared border? The truth is a heavily guarded secret in American political circles, precisely because it completely ruins their narrative. Nearly 100% of all American dairy exports bound for Canada cross our border with zero tariffs. None. Not a 10% duty, not a 50% duty, free. Industry data and extensive research from institutions like Cornell University prove that 9% of United States dairy entering Canada is completely duty-free. So why the screaming? Why the endless threats of a 300% tariff wall? Because Canada operates on a complex quota system known as supply management. Those massive, terrifying tariff rates only kick in if American exporters exceed a specific agreed-upon volume limit. And here is the punchline that Washington desperately wants to keep buried. American producers have never even come close to hitting that ceiling. The quota gates are wide open, and the Americans are not even walking through them. The 298% tariff wall they are complaining about is entirely theoretical. It was built to hold back a flood that simply is not coming. Which brings us to a massive and glaring contradiction. If you rewind the clock to 2018, Donald Trump was in the middle of tearing up NAFTA. He promised to fix the so-called Canadian dairy disaster once and for all. He bullied, he tweeted, and he renegotiated the deal. He signed the new agreement, which we call CUSMA. And he stood in front of the cameras and declared a historic victory. He explicitly told American farmers that the Canadian dairy problem was solved because he had secured new tariff-free quotas for American exporters. Yet here we are, years later, staring down a mandatory 2026 review of that exact same trade deal. And his administration has resurrected the exact same ghost to justify threatening the entire agreement all over again. On one side of the border, United States trade officials are launching dumping investigations and making non-negotiable demands, claiming Canada is unfairly blocking trade. But simultaneously, America's own Department of Agriculture openly admits in its official reports that almost all agricultural products traded between our two nations move freely without quotas or tariffs. Both things cannot be true at the same time. They are talking out of both sides of their mouths. It is a manufactured crisis designed purely for negotiating leverage. But the consequences of playing this high-stakes game of chicken are deeply real for Canada. Now, we reach the detail that almost every major media outlet has missed. And it is the single most important element of this entire geopolitical chess match. While Washington beats its chest and demands that Ottawa tear down its supply management system, they are demanding something that is literally impossible to give. In the summer of 2025, the Canadian Senate quietly passed a piece of legislation known as Bill C-202. You will rarely hear about this law in international headlines, but it fundamentally changes the balance of power. Bill C-202 legally prohibits any Canadian government from negotiating away dairy protections in any international trade deal. The system is now protected by federal law. Supply management is completely off the table. It is legally ring-fenced. Think about the absolute gravity of this situation. The Americans are conditioning the survival of a $6 trillion trade relationship on Canada opening its dairy market. Mark Carney and Canadian officials are smiling, shaking hands, and using diplomatic buzzwords like modernization and flexibility to keep the Americans at the table. But underneath that diplomatic language, Canada is negotiating with handcuffs on. It does not matter who the Prime Minister is. It does not matter what threats Washington hurls across the border. It is illegal for our government to concede to Washington's demands unless Parliament entirely reverses its own legislation. We are watching a high-stakes performance where both governments know a deal on dairy is fundamentally impossible. Yet they continue to drive the car toward the cliff. Who benefits from this charade? Politicians, who are desperate to score points with their domestic bases. But who pays the price when the car goes over the edge? This is where the political theater crashes violently into your reality. If the upcoming CUSMA review fails because of this manufactured deadlock, the agreement does not vanish overnight, but it enters a state of perpetual, year-by-year uncertainty. For a country like Canada, whose economy is fundamentally tethered to the American market, uncertainty is a poison. Investment freezes. Supply chains fracture. Trucking companies, agricultural processors, and manufacturing plants across our country suddenly face a massive question mark hanging over their futures. We imported over $1 billion in American dairy last year. Shutting down that cross-border flow hurts everyone. American farmers in places like Wisconsin, New York, and California rely on the Canadian market just as much as we rely on their goods. But let us turn the mirror inward for a second. Because being fiercely Canadian also means being completely honest about our own economic flaws. Our supply management system is deeply, inherently protectionist. Yes, it protects about 10,000 Canadian dairy farmers, ensuring they have stable, predictable incomes in a volatile global market. But that protection is not free, and the government is not paying for it. Supply management acts as a hidden, regressive tax on every single Canadian citizen. Economists and organizations like the Bank of Canada have analyzed this extensively. And the estimates show that supply management costs the average Canadian family between $300 and $600 extra every single year in higher food costs. You pay for it every time you buy a gallon of milk. You pay for it with every block of cheese. You pay for it when you buy a coffee or a pizza. At a time when Canadians are being crushed by the cost of living, we are artificially inflating the price of basic groceries. So, as Canadians, we are left holding a very heavy, very contradictory burden. We are overpaying for basic necessities at home to protect a tiny fraction of our national workforce, while simultaneously risking our entire national economy because Washington is lying about the impact of that very same system on their farmers. It is absolutely infuriating to watch how this narrative is being manipulated by the media across the spectrum. If you look at American conservative media, they are running wild with the 300% tariff number. They frame it as Canadian theft. They use it to fire up American consumers and justify aggressive trade policy. but they conveniently erase the fact that 99.9% of their milk enters Canada completely free. If you look at liberal media outlets, they complain endlessly about Trump's chaotic trade wars and diplomatic bullying. But they completely ignore the fact that Canada's own rigid, legally binding protectionism is helping fuel the fire. And the centrist outlets, they just give you a boring, sterile rundown of trade tribunals, panel decisions, and legal mechanisms without ever explaining that ordinary families are the ones who are going to absorb the financial blast. Make no mistake, there are legitimate grievances hidden beneath all this political noise. The International Trade Commission recently conducted an investigation and found that Canada has, at times, manipulated how we allocate our duty-free quotas. We have structured things in a way that ensures certain American products still have a hard time competing on our grocery store shelves, even when they do not face those massive tariffs. The 2022 USMCA dispute panel actually sided with the United States on this specific quota administration issue. We have not played perfectly by the rules, but there is a massive structural difference between fixing a bureaucratic quota dispute and blowing up the most integrated, profitable bilateral trade relationship on the face of the planet. So what does this mean for Canada moving forward? We are caught in an unprecedented vice grip. On one side, we have an American administration using fake outrage, theoretical tariffs, and misunderstood numbers to extort concessions ahead of a critical trade deadline. On the other side, we have a Canadian legal reality that legally prevents our negotiators from backing down. No matter how intense the economic pressure gets, we are staring down a trade war where the political incentives for leaders in Washington demand an explosion. But the economic reality for everyday Canadians demands absolute stability. Canada must stand its ground against manufactured bullying. We cannot let a false narrative about 300% tariffs dictate our national economic sovereignty or destroy a trade agreement that supports millions of jobs. But at the same exact time, we need to have a very sobering, uncomfortable conversation with ourselves about what our own protectionist laws are truly costing us. We have to ask ourselves if risking $6 trillion in continental trade is worth fiercely defending a dairy system that actively makes life more expensive for everyday Canadians who are just trying to feed their families. The next few months will determine the economic trajectory of our nation for a decade. The deadline is real. The legal roadblocks are real. And the cost of failure will be paid by every single one of us. Now, I want to hand this over to you, because this is a conversation that needs to happen outside of Ottawa and Washington. Should Canada hold the line, stand behind our dairy farmers, and risk the entire CUSMA agreement? Or is this internal protectionism going to cost our country much more than it is actually worth? Drop your thoughts down in the comments, because we need to figure out where we stand before the politicians decide for us. And if this breakdown helped you see through the political spin and the weaponized numbers, share this with someone who still thinks this is just a minor dispute about milk. Because understanding what is actually happening at our borders is the only way we protect our future.